let's talk real quick about use of lethal force. So again, we talked about expectations and learning things from Hollywood. And so that most of what we believe about what is justified when it comes to shooting somebody is from there, because we've seen a bunch of gunfights, and Hollywood will paint a picture very clearly of really their morality and what they believe a justified use of force is and what's not, right? And usually it's really stark, in a movie, because we want to be clear to everybody who's a good guy and who's a bad guy. Like in movies, typically the good guys don't shoot until they're shot at, right? Yeah, pretty normal thing. A good example of that, is Han Solo in episode 4 in the Mos Eisley Cantina when Greedo comes and has him sit down, right? And then this is like an internet meme debate thing now, because basically they changed the movie. So originally, like, he sits down and Greedo's pointing a gun at him, and he sits down and he's talking to him all casually, puts his feet up and kind of under the table, takes his attention off the blaster, and then at one point is like, "I'll bet you have," boom, and shoots him and kills him, right? And then later, I think it was probably in the early 2000s, they went back and redid the movie and they added a bunch of stuff, and one of the things they add is Greedo shooting before Han shoots, and the shot missing, and then Han shooting. Right? And that is a trend in society and culture about like what people's expectations are about use of force. And so basically we've conditioned most people to think you can't shoot somebody unless they shoot at you first, right? And it's often like even in the schoolyard, right? Like, well, who hit who first? Like somehow that's an indicator. Legally, that's never been the case, right? Legally, it is a reasonable expectation based on the circumstances of bodily harm or great bodily harm. And so if you, based on the circumstances, can believe you are in jeopardy of harm in some way, then you can use force and potentially lethal force to defend yourself. So it's not about who hit first. It's about size and capability and circumstance and who provoked and who's threatening and like all of the things that go into play to affect it. And it's not about who hit first, because sometimes you can shoot the person first. Like Han was, obviously a lot of people don't think he was justified, but I think he was justified in shooting Greedo, right? Given the totality of the circumstances and the fact that, Greedo was sent there by Jabba the Hutt to try to collect money, and he knows Greedo to be a mercenary working for a gangster that has killed people in the past, and he's pointing a gun at him, and he's making threats, and it's reasonable that Greedo would shoot him. And so it's reasonable that Han would use lethal force to defend himself. And so, in my opinion, I don't think they needed to make that change, right? And that is the case, right? When we see that, we've seen that with law enforcement over the last, for sure, well, big change, Ferguson, like 2014 or so, whenever that occurred, 2014, 2015. And then an even bigger change during COVID with all the Black Lives Matter riots and all that kind of stuff, right? Huge change in people's perception and expectation about when is force justified. And I mean, it's a weird thing because like an incident happens and people think it's not justified, and then all this other stuff comes out of that, of riots and other things, and again, like the rules of engagement have changed, at least the societal expectation of them. But legally they haven't. They've started to change legally, but not as fast as the public's perception of them has changed. And so ultimately, so there's kind of a model for how to think about the whole thing. And the model, there's a three-pronged model of ability, opportunity, and jeopardy. Okay, so you have to, if we're talking about lethal force, generally when it comes to lethal force, the amount, like you have to believe you're in fear of death or great bodily harm. And that would be defined as something like some permanent disfigurement or something like that, right? Someone could poke you in the eye and you could lose an eyeball and not die, right? But that's a permanent disfigurement that's pretty serious, and you would be justified in using lethal force to keep someone from poking you in the eyeball and taking your eye out, right? Like a little scratch and a little scar on the arm, probably not, right? So if you have some weird person walking around and like scratching people with a little piece of wire, they just walk around doing that to people, like that's an assault and they shouldn't do that. And you know, you're aware of that thing and that person keeps doing that. Are you justified in shooting that person in the face because they were trying to scratch you with their little piece of wire? No, you wouldn't, right? Even though that's like a permanent thing, it's not, it doesn't rise to the level. Whereas like losing an eyeball clearly rises to the level. People would consider rape as something that rises to the level of, like, it's a weird thing because there's like, you know, if you think about it even just from a physical standpoint, maybe there's not the long-term physical trauma, but there's certainly, like, it's mixed together with emotional and other things that pushes it to that point. And for the most part, we would all, you know, if we started naming examples of things, we would all probably agree on it. So ability, someone has to have the ability to cause death or great bodily harm, right? So if there's the presence of a gun by the attacker, that would pretty obvious they have the ability, right? If a disparity of force can be a thing, right? So you have a big strong guy and a small little weak person, like a adult versus a small child, or a, you know, a fit strong man versus a slight female, right? Those are the things, be disparity of force things. And depending on the circumstances, you might be able to use lethal force to defend yourself against that disparity of force, right? So weapons, size and ability. Like if you know maybe someone's smaller and not as strong as you, but you know something about them, right? You know that person is like a black belt in jiu-jitsu and a whole bunch of other things, and they've, you know, murdered 4 people, and they're a hothead, and you know the circumstances of the previous murders, and they happen to be out after 25 years in prison, and like, you know, maybe they're not bigger, maybe they're not stronger than you, but there's a totality of circumstances that is put forth where you know, like, this situation is similar to the situation where he killed that other guy, and maybe he's going to try to kill me, and you might use lethal force to defend yourself, right? So, and all of that is the particular circumstances of your situation. So you got to know there has to be ability, and there also has to be opportunity. So the opportunity would be presence, right? So if like somebody calls you up from the other side of the country and is like, I'm going to stab you with a knife, you know, and like, are you then justified in calling someone up to go over there and find them and kill them? And that's justified use of lethal force? No, it's not, right? Because they might have the ability because they're actually holding a knife in their hand when they're talking to you on the phone, but they don't have the opportunity. And so because there's no opportunity, it doesn't work, right? And the same, you know, like you're laying there with a sniper rifle at 500 yards and that guy has a knife saying, I'm going to kill you, right? And you're like, cool, right? Like that would not fly as well, right? They have to actually have the ability. That person has ability, that person doesn't have an opportunity. And it is not reasonable for you to take that 500-yard shot when you could just get in your car and drive away, right? And call the police or do whatever. So ability and opportunity. And then the final piece would be a thing called jeopardy. And so by the totality of the circumstances, by that person's actions, they are doing something that places you in reasonable fear of death or great bodily injury, right? So they got ability, they have opportunity, and the totality of the circumstances gives you a reasonable expectation of jeopardy. So an example that doesn't meet that criteria is like the example that's usually used is like you're in the kitchen with your wife or some other person and they're chopping carrots with a knife, right? And so because they're chopping carrots with a knife, do they have ability to cause death or great bodily harm? Yes. Do they have opportunity? Right? So is the right answer then to shoot your wife in the head? No, it's not, right? And it's not because the circumstances, they're not doing something to put you in jeopardy, right? You're in the kitchen with somebody and they're doing the same thing, and it's this person that, again, like they murdered somebody before, and they're your neighbor or whatever, and you thought you were getting along, and you had a bunch of arguments in the past where they made threats of killing you and they did a bunch of weird things, and then all of a sudden they pick up the knife and they face you and they're like, I'm gonna kill you, motherfucker, and they start coming at you with the knife. Is that different? Right? It might be reasonable for you to like maneuver and pull out a gun and shoot that person, right? But that jeopardy is the thing that's there, right? There's jeopardy. And so you have to have ability, you have to have opportunity, and you have to have jeopardy. And if you don't have those three things, you are not going to be justified in using lethal force to defend yourself. Some of you may have scenarios that you've thought of, right? And so the hard thing is if we were to talk through scenarios, the scenarios that I've painted thus far are pretty simple, straightforward scenarios, and I try to make them very easy so it's clear to us to illustrate the point. Your scenario may be less clear, right? And so then the way to answer the question isn't necessarily to ask other people. You could and talk through it because that's helpful, but it's to apply ability, opportunity, and jeopardy. Are those three prongs met? Right? There's some people who want to say, if someone broke into my house, I'd shoot them. I'd say, is there ability, is there opportunity, and is there jeopardy? And some unauthorized entry to a residence is not necessarily ability, opportunity, and jeopardy, right? Nick has a story about that, or not. Nick doesn't, but Tink does, right? Where some drunk guy broke into their house and then fell asleep on the couch, and he thought.
And she shot him in the face.
Right? Which is crazy and traumatic. And so like she called 911 and the police came and broke in the door and hauled the guy out. But he wasn't.
Were you asleep the whole time?
I was gone.
Oh, worse.
Yeah. But what would how would it be now if Tink would have shot him?
Awful. Yeah. You'd still be dealing with it.
Probably, right? I mean, at least emotionally and spiritually you'd still be dealing with it, if not legally. And might you be justified? I mean, based on the circumstances, you probably can get away legally with shooting anyone that comes in your house. You'll probably win, even though technically,
You shouldn't.
yeah, it may not, depending on the state that you live in, it may or may not be justified. But the legally, like the civil legal battle, the emotional battle, and the spiritual battle that then you need to sort through is pretty significant. And so you should have ability, opportunity, and jeopardy, right? Like if you live it also depends on where you live. It depends on what time of day it is. It depends on what the temperature is outside. Like, do homeless people sometimes wander their way into somebody's garage that's open when it's 15 degrees outside, right? So that person is technically, again, they've gone into your house and they've invaded your house at night. And so do you go shoot that guy? That would be, again, you might get away with that, but do you want to deal with that? Probably not. So ability, opportunity, and jeopardy. The other piece there is a thing called, let me just clarify one point. Ability, opportunity, jeopardy, and it is from your perspective, right? So it's not from hindsight 2020 after investigating all of the circumstances. It is an issue of reasonableness. So from your perspective, based on what you knew at the time, is what you did reasonable? Was there a reasonable understanding of ability, a reasonable understanding of opportunity, and a reasonable understanding of jeopardy? right? All of those, that is the perspective that you're evaluated from, not hindsight 2020, what the investigators are able to uncover that actually is the circumstance. Which is why the kid with the airsoft gun that points it at the cop and the cop shoots him, right? In hindsight, that kid wasn't a lethal threat, but the cop didn't know that at the time, and potentially based on the circumstances, you know, I mean, I know a guy, I know a cop who did that, and I know a couple other cops who had a similar circumstance and didn't, right? And like, it was really crappy for the guy who shot that kid. Like, it was like a 15-year-old kid with like an AK-47 airsoft gun, and that kid thought it would be cool to point it at the cops, and he's dead. And then I know another guy who, you know, they were called to a neighborhood of a man with a gun, and like a bunch of dudes, you know, are deploy out trying to find the guy. They see the guy, and you know, gun is out. He sees the guy is starting to mount his gun. He's up and prepping the trigger to break the shot, and he's just like, this isn't right, and like backs off. And it ended up being that the guy had an airsoft gun. Right? And I don't know, you know, like your brain processes more information sometimes than you can articulate. So I don't know exactly what the inputs were for that guy to decide to not shoot. But there was something there, and it ended up being the right thing. Right? But would he have been justified in shooting the guy? Absolutely he would. Like, legally he'd be justified. And that's some of the issues, like what's the legal thing and like what's the moral thing? And those sometimes do not coincide. Right? So we got ability, opportunity, jeopardy. The fourth thing that isn't required is required in some states. Like I think California, it's required. Required in some states is a thing called preclusion. Okay, and preclusion is the idea that you have to do everything you can to avoid the situation, that everything that is reasonable to avoid the situation. Right? And so like in Tink's circumstance, she could have gone down there and shot the guy. But she chose not to. She chose to like barricade herself and call the police. And so she tried to avoid the conflict, right? Which is totally reasonable, and in hindsight was the wise thing to do, right? You want to see some sort of more significant aggressive action before you kill somebody, right? And so you're not, it's like some people talk about it like stand your ground laws, right? So like there's some states where, yeah, you can do that, but is that a good idea, right? Are you shooting the person because of pride, or are you shooting the person because you have to? And there's a whole lot of people who want to be really cool that think shooting the person is the right thing to do. I mean, I was on a podcast once where people were asking me about that. And I talked about like home. I mean, the question came up about like someone invades your home, what do you do? And I talked about, well, you get everybody you care about, you go and find a secure room, lock the door, and barricade yourself inside that room and call the police. And they laughed at me. Right? They thought that was funny. Like, you know, from their perspective, you're like, go get them. Right? Go get them. Because that's what, if you were a real man, that's what you would do. You'd go get them. Right? You defend your castle, defend your house, defend your family, and go, America, freedom. And that, I mean, that's a common idea, but usually that is someone who has absolutely no experience like doing anything that has to do with lethal force confrontations and movement in a structure. Like the complex, like even if you know the situation, the complexity and challenge of trying to, as a one person, as a dude with nothing but a gun, to go try to find somebody else in your house and kill them without getting killed first. Yeah, I mean, you probably would win if you had a little bit of training, because the bad guy probably doesn't, right? But you don't know that. And if you really believe that person is there to try to kill you, in that circumstance, maybe they actually do, right? Because most people are like, if they know they're going to go do a thing, they're going to prep for that in some way. And they're going to have some sort of plan. So if you believe that person just broke in your house to steal a TV, then let them take the TV. If you really believe they're there to try to kill you, then like all the more, like go stack the odds in your favor and use tactics and force them into, like Leon the Professional, right? Like if you want to be cool, then set up your ambush for them, right? That's the answer is an ambush. The answer is not like going on patrol, right? Like you don't go on some recon patrol to go look for things. No, if you know you're going to get into a gunfight, you set up an ambush. And it's just like it's blowhard, bravado foolishness to go do that kind of thing. So that's a bad idea. And I like anybody who has any experience, even a little bit, will usually be like, yeah, that sounds like a bad idea of trying to find the person and kill them, right? Let them come to you, stack the odds in your favor. And it makes it clear too, right? Like, do you really want to shoot somebody because they're trying to steal your laptop? No, hopefully not, right? If you do, then you probably shouldn't be here. And if you work for me, you probably should be fired. Yeah. But if it's like you want it to be, you want to shoot somebody if they are trying to kill you. And you also want that to be perfectly clear that that's what they're doing, right? The hard part is like the actual shooting part. Like everybody here, even, we have a disparity of skill, but we're all hitting a man-sized target at this distance, right? It's not that hard to hit the person. The hard part is making the decision to do it, right? It's the mindset connected to that is have you mentally prepared for this, and can you make the decision to do that thing? And that's always the failure. That's the failure that people have, like PTSD and stuff like that. Like that is from decision making, right? It's not from the trauma of the event. It's from the trauma of the decision that either was made or not made to do a thing. And then you have to live with that, or you got to live with whatever the thing is. And I mean, I know personally, like I've had lots of experiences in my life where, I mean, like the first time I went to a call where somebody needed CPR, and I was like, well, my first aid in CPR training really sucks because I was not very decisive in the decisions that I was making, and it's like, I need to work on that. And the same, like an AED, same thing. Like the first time, it's like, man, I really don't want to go to that AED call. And do you want to be the guy who's trying to avoid the call? Or do you want to be the guy who's trying to go to the call because you're confident in your skills and your decision-making ability, and you're going to go save a life, right? So it is that decision-making, and the decision-making is the thing that keeps people from doing stuff. Like it's the fear of being wrong. And the more you physically and mentally prepare for the situation, the more confidence you will have. It ties back to mindset and confidence. The whole thing is like this mindset, tactics, skill, and equipment circle thing, right? Where it's all tied together. Even though there's a hierarchy, they're all tied together. And you want that. You want to have strong decision-making and quick decision-making and confident decision-making skills. And that comes through experience and training and exposure to things. A question, and sometimes people overthink the thing because they don't want to be wrong. So you got to kind of think about this question from kind of your core guttural reaction. Like if you felt morally compelled to do something, but you also knew it was illegal, like would you do the thing? Right? Would you go and act because you believe it's the right thing to do, particularly in the instant, in the moment, right? Is it the head thoughtfulness, or is it like the heart? And what are you going to do? Okay? And then the flip side, if you believe something, if you were legally justified in doing something, but you thought it was immoral, would you do it? No, right? Like there's lots of things that we're legally justified in doing that we think are wrong, and we don't do them. I think the fear to act is the belief that somebody holds to a moral position that is illegal. Does that make sense? Like, because you're going to do whatever it is the thing you believe in doing. And people will not act because they're fearful that the thing they believe that they're doing is possibly illegal.
Fear of authority. And the authority is different. It can be different for different people.
When it comes to force, like use of force, like lethal force, right?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, authority would
Authority
be,
of like some law.
yep, or something, yep. And so people may be afraid to act because of that.
Or sometimes it's just fear of others.
Yep. And so the key is to, well, y'all are adults and you've lived, you know, you're not in prison right now, right? Whether you've been to jail before or not, at least right now you're not in prison. And y'all probably qualify to have a concealed pistol license of some sort. And so you've lived most of your life on this earth as a reasonable person doing reasonable things. And it is the law is looser, like aside from speeding, which isn't a criminal thing, right? It's a civil thing. But generally in the criminal world, the law is much looser than most of our moral compasses. And so, aside, like, the guy with the bravado that shoots everybody that comes in your house, that's a different problem. That's not really a moral compass problem. That's a guy who has bravado that hasn't really thought through his desire to justify his manness, right? But like if you're a reasonable person that is not trying to show off, like do the thing that you believe is right and don't worry about it, is I think the answer, right? There are classes, like there's this, actually the guy that came up with the Priority to Survival, Masad Ayub, he teaches a class called Justified or Judicious Lethal Force or something like that. And it's like a 40-hour seminar covering case law and all kinds of stuff, which is, you know, if you want to nerd out about that, it's super interesting. But what happens is, like weird pedantic people get all mind bent around all kinds of nuanced case law stuff, and then they like don't have the ability to act. And so the right answer is, I think for everybody here, is do what you believe is the right thing to do and don't worry about it. And it might be expensive and it might be difficult, so don't do it unless you have to. But do it if you have to. Like don't let that get in the way of things. And then kind of the final note on that is like when the police show up to a scene, they're in charge. Right? Regardless of what, like the time to fight the police is in court later on, not during the thing. Right? And even like a plainclothes police officer knows that about the uniformed cops. Right? When patrol shows up, like say there's a buy-bust thing and they didn't deconflict and they don't know they're there or it's out of jurisdiction, like those undercover people are trained to know when the uniforms show up, like they're in charge. And you let them handle the thing and you sort all of that stuff out later on, right? And so when they show up, like it's not time, like you pay a lawyer to help you sort it out, not yourself. So zip your lips. Keep your mouth shut. If describing the bad guy and telling them like there's an AK-47 in those bushes, like that might be a thing that you do because there's like a community caretaking aspect to that. But other than that, and identifying yourself, like there's nothing like you certainly will be tempted. You will want to justify yourself, right? Because you just shot somebody, and like you're the weird guy that shot somebody. Right? And how many, like, do we even know, like, outside of law enforcement and military, do you guys know anybody who's shot somebody? I mean, that's super weird. I mean, I don't. I mean, maybe you do, but it's probably one person if you do, right? Or you grew up in a place where there are a bunch of criminals, right? I guess the idea of lethal justified shooting, right? That's super weird. And you'd be the guy who, like if you shot somebody, you're now known as the guy that shot that guy. And like that's it forever, kind of. When people, particularly in a small town like Moscow, you walk down the street, everyone's going to know what you look like. Be like, oh, you're the dude that shot that guy. And you're going to want to justify that, but that's not the time and the place. Like, it's going to just add zeros to your bill if you talk, right? It'll get sorted out, but just start adding zeros to the end if you say too much. It'll just be expensive.